6 inches. That's how much rock a crew of 10 men could drill through in a 12-hour shift. 6 inches into solid granite using nothing but hand drills and black powder. And they did this every single day for years. This wasn't one tunnel. This was how America built railroads through mountains before we had the technology to do it any other way. Before compressed air drills, before nitroglycerin, before anyone understood that you could actually die from breathing rock dust. The men who did this work knew they probably wouldn't survive it. They knew the mountain could collapse on them. They knew the black powder could explode while they were packing it. They knew the fuse could be too short.
And they went into those tunnels anyway, because someone was willing to pay them $3 a day. So, how did America drill through solid mountains using only hand tools? What did it cost to bore a mile-long tunnel at 6 inches per day? And what happened to the men who swung those hammers? In 1850, if you wanted to build a railroad across America, you had a problem. Mountains. The Appalachians in the east, the Rockies in the west, the Sierra Nevada in California. All of them standing between the cities that needed connecting and the resources on the other side. You had 3 choices. Go around them, which added hundreds of miles and made the route economically pointless. Go over them, which meant grades so steep your locomotives couldn't pull anything. Or go through them.
Going through meant drilling tunnels. And in 1850, drilling tunnels meant hand drills, black powder, and time. Lots of time. The first major railroad tunnel in America was the Allegheny Portage Tunnel in Pennsylvania. Started in 1831. It was 875 feet long. Took 4 years to complete. That's about 200 feet per year. 6 inches per day. But that was just the beginning. By 1860, railroad companies were planning tunnels that made the Allegheny look like practice. The Hoosac Tunnel in Massachusetts was going to be 5 miles long. The Summit Tunnel in California, for the Central Pacific Railroad, needed to go through 1,700 feet of solid Sierra granite. Nobody knew if this was even possible.
The longest tunnel in the world at that time was the Mont Cenis Tunnel in the Alps, and that was still under construction. They'd been working on it for 8 years and weren't even halfway through. But American railroad companies didn't care about possible. They cared about building the transcontinental railroad before their competitors did. So they hired engineers who'd never built a tunnel before. They recruited workers who'd never seen a mountain. And they started drilling. The method they used was simple, brutally simple. You start at the tunnel face. That's the end of the hole you're drilling. It's dark. The only light comes from candles or oil lamps that the men carry. The air is thick with rock dust from yesterday's drilling. You can taste it on your tongue. It coats your throat. Your eyes water constantly. The dust sticks to your sweat until you're covered in a layer of gray paste. The temperature in the tunnel depends on where you are. Near the entrance, you feel the outside air. 100 feet in, that disappears. The temperature stabilizes at whatever the rock wants it to be. In summer tunnels, that might be 60 degrees. In winter, when you're drilling through a mountain at 7,000 feet elevation, it's 40 degrees. Your hands go numb. The steel drill becomes so cold, it burns your skin if you touch it with bare hands. Your crew is 10 men, 2 drillers and 8 strikers. The drillers hold the steel drill, a rod about 3 feet long with a chisel point on the end. The strikers swing 8-pound sledgehammers. The driller positions the drill bit against the rock. He holds it steady, angled slightly upward. The angle matters. Too steep and the hole goes up into the roof. Too shallow and you're drilling into the floor. You want the blast holes to break the rock forward, not up or down. The first striker swings. The hammer hits the back of the drill. The impact drives the chisel point a fraction of an inch into the granite. The shock travels up the drill rod, through the driller's hands, into his arms and shoulders. The driller rotates the drill a quarter turn. The second striker swings. Bang. Rotate. Bang. Rotate. Bang. Rotate. They do this for 12 hours. The rhythm is critical. 2 strikers working in alternation, one from the left, one from the right. The driller has to time his rotation to happen in the split second between hammer strikes. Miss the timing and the drill is still moving, when the next hammer comes down. That's how drills break. That's how drillers lose fingers. The strikers have their own timing to maintain. Too slow and the rhythm breaks. Too fast and you're swinging before the driller has rotated the bit. The strikers, who lasted more than a year, could do this with their eyes closed. They felt the rhythm in their muscles. They knew exactly when to swing without having to think about it. The rhythm is everything. If the driller doesn't rotate the drill fast enough, the bit gets stuck. If he rotates it too far, the next strike hits off center and the drill jumps. If a striker mistimes his swing, he hits the driller's hands instead of the drill. That's how you lose fingers. After 4 hours of this, you've drilled a hole about 2 feet deep. You need 30 of these holes to make a single blast, so you move to a new position and start again. Bang, rotate, bang, rotate. The noise in that tunnel is constant. 10 sledgehammers hitting steel, creating a ringing that never stops. Your ears don't just ring after a shift. They scream. Some men went deaf after a year of this work. Most had permanent hearing damage after 6 months. When all 30 holes are drilled, you pack them with black powder. This is where it gets dangerous. Black powder in 1860 wasn't stable. It absorbed moisture from the air. It could ignite from a spark, from friction, from someone breathing on it wrong. You're packing it into holes that are still hot from the drilling. You're doing this by candlelight. One mistake, and you're not just dead, you're vapor. The powder man uses a long wooden rod to tamp the black powder down to the bottom of the hole. Metal rods were banned after an incident at the Allegheny Tunnel in 1834, when a powder man used an iron tamping rod and created a spark. The resulting explosion killed 4 men and brought down 80 feet of tunnel. The wooden rod has to be long enough that the powder man can stand back from the hole while tamping, but it also has to be strong enough to compress the powder without breaking.
If the rod breaks while you're tamping, you've got a stick wedged in a hole full of black powder. You have to pull it out carefully. Very carefully. One wrong move, and the friction of the wood sliding against rock ignites the powder. Then he packs clay on top to contain the explosion. The clay has to be packed tight. Too loose, and the explosion vents out the hole instead of breaking the rock. Too tight, and you risk compressing the powder too much, which can cause it to detonate while you're packing. Then he inserts a fuse, making sure it's long enough that the crew can get clear before it burns down to the powder. The fuse goes in through the clay plug. It has to reach the powder, but not touch the sides of the hole. If it touches rock, friction from the burning fuse can cause premature detonation. How long is long enough? Nobody really knew. Fuses weren't standardized. Some burned at a rate of 30 seconds per foot. Some burned at 45 seconds per foot. The powder man tested each batch of fuse by burning a 1 foot length and timing it. Then he cut the fuses based on that timing, adding an extra foot for safety. Sometimes the extra foot wasn't enough. When all 30 charges are set, the powder man lights the fuses and runs. The entire crew runs. You've got maybe 90 seconds to get far enough away that falling rock won't kill you. The explosion comes in waves. 30 charges don't all go off at exactly the same time. You hear the first blast, then more, overlapping. The sound bouncing off the tunnel walls until you can't tell how many there were. The concussion hits you in the chest. Rock dust blows out of the tunnel entrance like smoke from a cannon. Then you wait. You wait for the dust to settle. You wait to make sure there are no secondary explosions from powder that got packed wrong. You wait to see if the roof is going to collapse. Sometimes it does. On April 12, 1865, at the Summit Tunnel in California, a blast brought down 60 tons of rock. 3 men were in the tunnel checking the charges. None of them made it out. The company records list their names as Chen, Wong, and Li. First names unknown. Ages unknown. The company paid $50 per body to the Chinese labor contractor. No compensation to families. That's how it worked. If you died in a tunnel, the company paid whoever recruited you. Your family got nothing. After the blast, assuming the roof didn't collapse, you go back in. The dust is so thick you can't see 2 feet in front of you. You feel your way along the tunnel wall. You find the face. You start clearing the rubble. This takes hours. You're moving rock by hand, passing it from man to man in a chain that leads out of the tunnel. You're doing this bent over because the tunnel isn't tall enough to stand up in yet. Your back starts hurting after 20 minutes. After 2 hours, the pain is constant. When the rubble is cleared, you measure your progress.
On a good day, with good rock and good powder, you've advanced 6 inches. Sometimes it's 4 inches. Sometimes the blast didn't break the rock cleanly, and you've got to drill it again. 6 inches. That's your day. Now do that math. A mile is 63,360 inches. At 6 inches per day, that's 10,560 days. 28 years. The railroad companies couldn't wait 28 years. So they tried to speed it up. They worked crews from both ends of the tunnel at once. That cut the time in half, but doubled the complexity because now you had to make sure the 2 tunnels actually met in the middle. Get your surveying wrong by a degree, and you'd have 2 tunnels that missed each other by 50 feet.
They also tried working from the top. On some tunnels, they'd sink a shaft straight down from the top of the mountain to where the tunnel was supposed to be. Then they'd work 4 faces at once, both ends and both directions from the shaft. This cut the time to 7 years for a mile-long tunnel. 7 years of men dying in the dark. Let me tell you about the Hoosac Tunnel. This is the one that proved just how bad it could get. Construction started in 1851. The tunnel was going to be 5 miles long, straight through Hoosac Mountain in western Massachusetts. It would connect Boston to the Great Lakes. The state of Massachusetts funded it. They thought it would take 4 years. It took 24 years, and it killed 195 men. The first deaths came from the drilling itself. Hands crushed by misplaced hammer strikes. Men hit by flying rock chips that had been heated by the drilling friction. Backs broken from bent-over work that went on for 10 hours at a stretch. Thomas Kelly lost 3 fingers on his left hand in 1856 when a striker named Murphy mistimed his swing. The hammer caught Kelly's hand instead of the drill. Kelly wrapped the stumps in a rag, finished his shift, and was back at work the next day. He couldn't hold a drill anymore, so they made him a striker. He worked another 15 years in the tunnel before the lung disease killed him. Patrick Shea died in 1858 when a piece of heated rock from the drilling flew into his eye. The rock was small, maybe the size of a grain of rice, but it had been superheated by the friction of the drill. It melted into his eye. The infection spread to his brain. He died 3 days later, screaming. He was 23 years old. But those were the small deaths. The ones that happened one at a time. The ones the company barely noticed. The big deaths came from the explosions. March 20th, 1865. The central shaft, the one they'd sunk from the top of the mountain, had reached 200 feet deep. A crew of 13 men were working at the bottom, drilling the next blast holes. The powder man had set charges to widen the shaft. Something went wrong with the fuse timing. The blast went off while the crew was still at the bottom.
The explosion didn't kill them. It destroyed the hoist mechanism. The ropes that lifted men in and out of the shaft burned through. The wooden platforms collapsed into the shaft. The 13 men at the bottom were trapped 200 feet underground with no way out. The rescuers tried to get down to them. They rigged new ropes. They lowered men on emergency platforms, but the shaft was filled with smoke and dust and fumes from the black powder. The rescuers couldn't breathe. They had to come back up. They tried pumping air down. They tried lowering food and water. They tried everything they could think of. For 3 days, they heard voices from the bottom of the shaft, men shouting for help. Then the voices stopped. It took them 6 days to get the shaft clear enough to reach the bottom. All 13 men were dead, some from the initial injuries, some from suffocation, some from thirst. The company records list them by number, not by name. Worker number 43 through worker number 55. That's how they tracked deaths on the Hoosac Tunnel, by number. But the workers knew their names. They were Irish immigrants, mostly. Men named Malloy, Shea, Sullivan, Kelly. They'd come to America because there was no work in Ireland. They'd taken jobs drilling tunnels because it paid more than factory work. $3 a day, that was enough to send money home. The Hoosac Tunnel had more deaths from nitroglycerin later when they started using it instead of black powder, but we'll get to that. Out west, the Transcontinental Railroad was facing different problems. The Central Pacific Railroad was building from California eastward. To get through the Sierra Nevada, they needed to drill 15 tunnels. The longest was the Summit Tunnel, 1,700 feet through solid granite at an elevation of 7,000 feet. The engineer, Theodore Judah, estimated it would take 2 years per tunnel. The company president, Leland Stanford, told him they didn't have 2 years. They needed it done in 1. Judah said it was impossible with the technology they had. Stanford fired him and hired someone who wouldn't say no. They started drilling in 1864. They worked 3 shifts around the clock. They used Chinese laborers recruited by the thousands from Guangdong province. The company preferred Chinese workers because they worked for less money, and according to the company records, because they were more expendable. That's a direct quote from a Central Pacific executive report. More expendable. The Chinese workers knew this. They knew the company didn't care if they lived or died. They knew their families would never see compensation if they were killed. And they worked anyway, because even this was better than starving in China. The wages tell the story. White workers on the Central Pacific made $35 per month plus room and board. Chinese workers made $26 per month and had to buy their own food and shelter. They were doing the same work, facing the same dangers, for 25% less money. The company justified this by saying Chinese workers cost less to feed because they ate rice instead of beef. The real reason was that Chinese workers couldn't vote, couldn't testify in court against white men, and couldn't organize for better conditions without risking deportation. The drilling method was the same, hand drills and black powder, but the conditions were worse. They were working at 7,000 feet in winter. The snow at that elevation didn't melt until June. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. The workers built tunnels just to reach the tunnel. They'd drill through 60 feet of snow, shore it up with timber, then drill through the rock underneath.
When spring came and the snow melted, those access tunnels would collapse. More men would die. The company ledgers from 1866 show payments to, quote, Chinese labor contractors for winter tunnel casualties, end quote. The amounts range from $20 to $50 per death, depending on the circumstances. Fall from scaffolding was $20. Crushed by rockfall was $30. Killed in explosion was $50. The company paid more if the death was dramatic, not because they cared, but because it was harder to recruit replacements if word got out that men were being blown apart. During the winter of 1866 to 1867, the worst winter in the Sierra Nevada in 20 years, 73 Chinese workers died at the Summit Tunnel site.
Not all at once, in 1s and 2s and 3s, frozen to death in the snow tunnels, killed by avalanches, suffocated when snow blocked the ventilation shafts, crushed when timber supports collapsed under the weight of wet snow. The company didn't stop work. They just recruited more workers from San Francisco. The Central Pacific records are incomplete, but historians estimate somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 Chinese workers died building those tunnels. The exact number isn't known because the company didn't record Chinese deaths the same way they recorded white deaths. If a white worker died, there was a name and a date in the records. If a Chinese worker died, there was a number and maybe a month. Usually not even that. One of the few names we have is Hung Hua. He was 19 years old. He died on February 8th, 1868, when a blast went off early at the Summit Tunnel. The only reason we know his name is because his brother, Hung Tai, was also on the work crew and survived to tell people what happened. Hung Hua was packing powder charges. The fuses were supposed to be 2 minutes long. This one was 40 seconds. When it exploded, Hung Hua was still in the tunnel, 15 feet from the blast. The company records list cause of death as crushed by rock. Hung Tai said his brother's body was never found. The tunnel collapsed on him, and they kept drilling. There's a spot in the Summit Tunnel, about 800 feet from the eastern portal, where workers found human bones in the rubble decades later. They were never identified. They were just shoveled aside and the work continued. The Summit Tunnel took 3 years to complete. When it opened in 1867, the Central Pacific held a ceremony. Leland Stanford gave a speech about American ingenuity and the triumph of progress. He didn't mention the dead workers. He didn't mention Hung Hua. He didn't mention the 1,000 other Chinese laborers who died to make his railroad possible. The technology did eventually improve. In 1866, a Swedish chemist named Alfred Nobel invented dynamite. It was more stable than black powder and had 3 times the explosive power. It meant you could drill fewer holes and advance faster. The Hoosac Tunnel switched to nitroglycerin in 1868. This was before Nobel had stabilized it into dynamite. They were using liquid nitroglycerin, which was even more unstable than black powder. It would explode if you shook it too hard. It would explode if the temperature changed suddenly. It would explode if you looked at it wrong. The workers were terrified of it. On November 28, 1870, a nitroglycerin storage house near the Hoosac Tunnel exploded. It wasn't supposed to be possible. The building was designed specifically to keep the nitroglycerin stable. It had temperature controls. It had ventilation. It had every safety feature the engineers could think of. It exploded anyway. The blast was heard 12 miles away. It created a crater 40 feet deep and 80 feet across. 4 workers were killed instantly. 3 more died from injuries over the next week. The company never determined what caused the explosion. After that, the workers on the Hoosac Tunnel refused to use nitroglycerin. They went back to black powder. They said they'd rather work slower than die from something they couldn't predict. The compressed air drill arrived in 1871. This was a drill powered by air pressure instead of hammer strikes. It could drill 10 times faster than hand drilling. It should have been a miracle. It was a death sentence. The problem was the dust. Hand drilling produced dust, but it was manageable. You could wet the hole to keep the dust down. You could work in shifts that gave the dust time to settle. You'd still breathe some of it, but not enough to kill you in 5 years.
The compressed air drill produced so much dust, so fast, that the tunnel filled with it. You couldn't see, you couldn't breathe, and you couldn't stop, because stopping meant losing your job. The drill worked by hammering a steel bit into the rock at incredible speed, 300 strikes per minute. Each strike created a tiny explosion of rock dust. Multiply that by 10 drills running simultaneously in a confined space, and you had a cloud of silica dust so thick it looked like smoke from a fire. The workers tried wetting the holes, but the compressed air blew the water away faster than they could apply it. They tried wearing cloth masks. The dust went right through the cloth. They tried breathing through wet rags. That just made them cough harder. The medical term is silicosis.
A dry cough that doesn't bring anything up. Then you start coughing up blood, because the scar tissue in your lungs is tearing from the effort of breathing. By the time you're coughing blood, you have maybe 2 years left, maybe less. The workers called it miner's consumption, or tunnel lung, or rock lung. They knew what caused it. Everyone who worked in the tunnels knew, but the companies didn't care. Lung disease took years to kill you. You'd be off the payroll long before you died. Not their problem. John Doane worked on the Hoosac Tunnel from 1872 to 1874. 2 years. He was a compressed air drill operator. By 1876, he couldn't walk up a flight of stairs without stopping to catch his breath. By 1878, he couldn't work at all. He applied to the company for compensation. They told him he'd left the job voluntarily 2 years ago. Whatever illness he had now wasn't related to his work. He died in 1881 at the age of 34. The doctor who examined him said his lungs looked like they'd been packed with sand. The autopsy report noted extensive pulmonary fibrosis consistent with prolonged silica exposure. The company never paid his widow a cent. There were hundreds of John Doanes, men who survived the explosions in the cave-ins and the falls, only to die slowly from the dust. Their names aren't in the official death counts. The official records only count men who died on the job site. If you died 5 years later from lung disease, that wasn't the company's problem. But the tunnels did get built. The Hoosac Tunnel opened in 1875, 24 years after they started. 5 miles long, 195 deaths during construction, hundreds more deaths from lung disease in the decades after. The Summit Tunnel opened in 1867, 3 years of drilling, more than 1,000 deaths during construction. The Cascade Tunnel in Washington State started in 1900, took 9 years. Fewer deaths because by then they had better technology. Electric lights, ventilation systems, compressed air drills that actually worked, but men still died. 23 confirmed deaths during construction. The tunnel is 7 3/4 miles long, and these were just the major tunnels. There were hundreds of smaller ones. Every mountain railroad had them. Some were a few hundred feet long, some were miles. All of them were built the same way: drilling, blasting, clearing rubble, drilling again, 6 inches at a time. The men who did this work came from everywhere. Irish immigrants fleeing famine, Chinese immigrants fleeing poverty, Welsh miners who knew rock work, Cornish miners who knew explosives, Italian stonecutters, Swedish laborers. Every immigrant group that came through America ended up in these tunnels at some point. They weren't unskilled labor. They were specialists. A good driller could feel the rock through the drill.
He knew when he was hitting soft stone versus hard. He knew when he'd hit a seam or a fault line. He knew when a drill bit was getting dull, just from the way the vibration changed in his hands. He knew how to angle the hole so the blast would break the rock cleanly, not just shatter it into pieces too small to clear efficiently. A driller who'd worked granite could switch to limestone and adjust his technique in 5 minutes. The drills had to bite differently. The angle had to change. The rotation speed had to be faster because limestone didn't hold the drill bit as tightly as granite. A good powder man could look at a rock face and tell you exactly where to put the charges and how much powder to use. Too little and you'd waste a blast.
You'd advance 2 inches instead of 6, and you'd have to drill the same face again tomorrow. Too much, and you'd bring down the roof or shatter the rock so badly that clearing it took twice as long as it should. The powder man had to understand the grain of the rock. Sedimentary rock broke along its layers. Igneous rock broke in chunks. Metamorphic rock, like schist or gneiss, could shear unexpectedly if you didn't respect its structure. This was knowledge that took years to acquire. You couldn't learn it from a book, because most of it wasn't written down. You learned it by watching the old powder men work. You learned it by making mistakes that cost you blasts. You learned it by nearly dying when a charge broke the wrong way. These men trained apprentices.
A driller would take on a young striker who showed promise. He'd teach him how to read rock through touch, how to feel when a fault line was coming, how to adjust the drill angle mid-hole without pulling it out. An experienced driller could drill a 30-foot hole that never deviated more than 2 inches from vertical. That was a skill that took a decade to master. The powder men passed on knowledge about rock types and drilling angles and powder amounts, which fuses burned true and which ones varied, how to tell if black powder had gotten damp, how to pack a charge so it broke rock forward instead of shattering it in place. Most of that knowledge was never written down. It lived in the hands and eyes and experience of the men who did the work. When they died, it died with them.
There was a driller on the Hoosac Tunnel named Owen Gallagher. He'd been a hard rock miner in Cornwall before he came to America. He could drill a hole straighter than anyone else on the crew. Other drillers would aim for vertical and end up 3 degrees off. Gallagher's holes were perfect. When they introduced compressed air drills, Gallagher refused to use them. He said they were too fast, too violent. They didn't let you feel the rock. The company told him to use the new drills or find other work. He quit. He died in 1883, age 57, from lung disease he'd developed drilling by hand for 20 years. At his funeral, the other workers talked about his skill. They said he was the best driller who ever worked the Hoosac.
Nobody wrote that down in any official record. It's only preserved because a local newspaper reporter happened to be there. The railroads that came out of those tunnels changed America. They connected the East Coast to the West. They made it possible to ship goods across the country in days instead of months. They created cities and places that couldn't have existed without rail access. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, was celebrated as one of the great achievements of American engineering. And it was. But it was built on top of roughly 10,000 dead workers. That number includes the tunnel workers, the graders who carved roadbeds through mountains, the bridge builders who spanned canyons, and the track layers who worked in all weather.
10,000 deaths for 1,800 miles of track. The financial cost was enormous too. The Hoosac Tunnel alone cost $21 million by the time it was finished. In 1875 dollars. Adjust for inflation, and you're looking at around $500 million today, for 5 miles of tunnel. The Central Pacific's 15 tunnels through the Sierra Nevada cost an estimated $30 million total, and that's about $700 million in today's money. But the human cost was higher. You can rebuild if you lose money. You can't bring back the dead. The families of the men who died got almost nothing. If you were killed in a tunnel collapse, your family might get $100 from the company, maybe, if they felt generous.
More often, they got nothing at all. The Chinese workers' families never got anything. The company's position was that they'd paid the labor contractor, and what the contractor did with the money wasn't their concern. Most labor contractors pocketed the death benefits. The families in China never knew their sons and husbands were dead until the letters stopped coming. There's a cemetery in Truckee, California, near the Summit Tunnel site. It has a section for Chinese railroad workers. There are about 200 graves marked with wooden markers that have long since rotted away. Nobody knows who's buried there. The markers weren't maintained. The names weren't recorded. Somewhere in that cemetery is probably Hung Hua. Maybe.
If they bothered to bury him separately from the other workers who died that month. The technology we use today to drill tunnels is completely different. We have tunnel boring machines that can drill through rock at 50 feet per day. Some of the largest ones can excavate an entire tunnel cross-section in a single pass. The Gotthard Base Tunnel in Switzerland, the longest rail tunnel in the world at 35 miles, took 17 years to build. That's less time than it took to build the 5-mile Hoosac Tunnel. Modern tunnels are safer too. The workers wear respirators. They have ventilation systems that remove the dust. They have sensors that detect methane and carbon monoxide. They have protocols for everything.
The death rate on modern tunnel construction is less than 1% of what it was in the 1800s. But something was lost when we gained that speed and safety. The men who drilled those early tunnels knew rock in a way we don't anymore. They could tell you the difference between granite from New Hampshire and granite from California just by the way it sounded when you hit it with a hammer. They knew which veins in the rock were solid and which were fractured. They knew where water would seep through and where it wouldn't. That knowledge is gone. We don't need it anymore. We have ground-penetrating radar. We have geological surveys. We have computer models that predict exactly what we're going to find before we drill.
But we lost something when we stopped needing to know rock that intimately. We lost the direct connection between the worker and the mountain. We lost the craftsman's understanding of stone. Owen Gallagher could feel a fault line through his drill 3 feet before the bit reached it. He could tell you the rock was about to change from hard to soft. Modern drilling machines can't do that. They just keep drilling until they hit something different. Then the operator adjusts the settings. That's better in most ways. It's faster. It's safer. But it's not the same. When you ride a train through a mountain tunnel today, you're traveling through history. Every tunnel in America that was built before 1900 was hand-drilled, 6 inches at a time.
By men who knew they probably wouldn't live to see it finished. The Hoosac Tunnel is still in use. The Summit Tunnel was bypassed by a new tunnel in 1993, but the old one is still there. You can see the entrance from the highway. The stones around the portal are still black from the smoke of 1,000 locomotives. Somewhere inside that tunnel, 800 feet from the eastern portal, are the bones of workers who were never recovered. The railroad just built over them and kept going. There's no marker. There's no memorial. There's just track and ballast and darkness. The men who died building these tunnels deserve to be remembered, not as numbers in a company ledger, not as statistics in a history book,
but as individuals who did impossible work under conditions that would kill most people today. Martin Malloy, who died in the Hoosac Central Shaft collapse in 1865. He was 37 years old. He'd been sending money back to his family in County Cork. Hung Hua, who died at 19 in the Summit Tunnel when a fuse burned too fast. His brother watched him die. John Doan, who survived the drilling but died from the dust at 34. He left behind a wife and 2 children, Owen Gallagher, who refused to use compressed air drills because they didn't let him feel the rock. He was the best driller who ever worked the Hoosac. These men weren't heroes. They didn't want to be. They were workers who took dangerous jobs because they needed the money.
but they did impossible things. They drilled through mountains using nothing but hand tools and black powder. They advanced 6 inches per day for years. They knew the work was killing them, and they did it anyway. The railroads they built connected a continent. The cities that grew up along those rail lines exist because these men were willing to drill through mountains. The economy that developed around transcontinental trade happened because someone was willing to pay $3 a day to swing a sledgehammer in the dark. Was it worth it? That's not a question I can answer. But I can tell you this. Every time a train goes through a mountain tunnel in America, it's traveling on top of the bones of men who died to make it possible. The Hoosac Tunnel, the Summit Tunnel, the Cascade Tunnel, all of them are graveyards that we built railroads through. And the men who made them possible, they're forgotten. Their names are lost, their skills are gone. What remains is the tunnel, and the debt we owe to the men who drilled it. If you want to understand how these workers got the stone out after blasting, that's in the next video about railroad grading and excavation. That's where this story continues. And if you made it this far, subscribe. I cover American infrastructure history every week. The stories of the men who built impossible things with their hands. I'll see you in the next one.